The rest of the evening unfolded exactly the way it always had. Only now I could see every detail with a kind of quiet precision that had been missing before, as if someone had adjusted the focus on a camera and brought everything into sharp, undeniable clarity. And I noticed how Ashley moved through the room like she owned not just the house, but the narrative itself, placing herself at the center of every conversation, touching Daniel's arm lightly when she laughed, guiding the direction of the evening with subtle shifts in tone and timing, while I remained at the edge of it all, present but not included, acknowledged only when politeness required it, and forgotten the moment it did not. The plate in front of me was full, but no one asked if I needed anything. No one refilled my glass. And when the conversation turned to plans for the coming year, I realized they spoke freely about trips, renovations, even a possible move, without once considering whether I might have a place in any of it. And that absence, that quiet erasure, settled over me more heavily than anything that had been said out loud. Daniel finally spoke to me halfway through dinner, asking if I was warm enough, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, as if he were checking a box rather than expressing genuine concern, and I smiled. The same small, controlled smile I had perfected over the years, and told him I was fine, because I was fine, more than fine in fact, because for the first time I was no longer guessing, no longer trying to interpret mixed signals or excuse behavior that had long since crossed the line from thoughtless to deliberate. Across the table, Ashley was describing a spring trip to Napa Valley, mentioning tasting rooms and boutique hotels, her eyes lighting up in a way that suggested she had already decided everything without needing anyone else's input. And when one of her friends asked if the whole family would be going, there was a brief pause, just a fraction of a second, before Ashley laughed softly and said they were keeping it small this time, just immediate family. And I watched Daniel nod in agreement, his expression neutral, and that was when I understood how thoroughly the definition of that word had been rewritten, how quietly and effectively I had been moved outside its boundaries without ever being told directly until tonight. I set my fork down and folded my hands in my lap, feeling the smooth fabric of my dress beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something real, something steady, and I let their voices wash over me without trying to follow every detail, because the specifics no longer mattered, not the destinations or the dates or the careful exclusions disguised as practical decisions. What mattered was the pattern, the consistency of it, the way it all fit together now into something complete and undeniable. And I thought back to that office again, to the weight of the folder in my hands, to the calm assurance in the attorney's voice when he had explained what my husband had arranged, how he had anticipated this possibility in a way I never had. And I felt a quiet gratitude for a man who had understood people more clearly than I ever allowed myself to. Someone at the table made a joke, and laughter followed, bright and easy, and I joined in just enough to avoid drawing attention, because there was no reason to disrupt the evening, no reason to reveal what I knew or what I was beginning to plan. And as I glanced once more at the tree, at the gifts carefully labeled and arranged for everyone except me, I realized that the absence was no longer something to be filled or corrected. It was something to be noted, recorded, and eventually, when the time was right, answered in a way none of them would see coming. By the time dessert was served, I had already stopped trying to follow the rhythm of the evening, because once you see the pattern clearly, you no longer need to study each individual moment to understand what it means. And I watched as Ashley placed plates of carefully arranged pastries in front of her guests, making a small show of remembering who liked what, who preferred chocolate over vanilla, who was avoiding sugar this month. Her attention to detail precise and deliberate, and when she reached me, she hesitated just long enough to make it noticeable before setting down a plate without asking, as if the choice did not matter because I did not matter, and I accepted it with the same quiet composure I had carried all night, offering a polite thank you that sounded almost automatic even to my own ears. And I let the silence settle around me when the conversation moved on, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to confirm. The truth had already revealed itself in 100 small ways throughout the night, each one reinforcing the same simple conclusion, and I felt a calm settle over me that was deeper than acceptance. It was resolution, the kind that comes when you stop asking why and start deciding what comes next. I thought again of the folder, of the signatures and clauses I had read carefully, of the quiet certainty they represented, and I understood that everything unfolding in this room was only one side of a story that had not yet reached its final chapter. And as I set my fork down and folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, I realized that the role they believed I occupied was one I had already begun to leave behind, even if they had not noticed it yet. The night air was colder than I expected when I stepped outside, the kind of sharp, quiet cold that settles into your bones and makes everything feel still for just a moment. And I stood there on the front porch adjusting my coat, listening to the muffled sound of laughter drifting from inside the house, a sound that no longer pulled me back in the way it once did, and for the first time, I did not hesitate before walking away from it. Daniel followed me out a minute later, the door closing softly behind him, and I could hear the uncertainty in his footsteps before he even spoke, as if he were trying to decide which version of himself to bring into this conversation. The son who used to stand beside me, without question, or the man who now measured every word against the expectations waiting for him inside that house. And when he finally said my name, it sounded careful, almost formal, as though we were no longer bound by the easy familiarity we once shared. He asked if everything was all right, if I was leaving already, and I turned to look at him under the soft glow of the porch light, noticing the lines around his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw, and I realized that he already knew the answer to his own question. He just did not know what to do with it. I told him I was tired, that it had been a long evening, and that was true in more ways than one, and he nodded, accepting the explanation because it required nothing from him, no difficult acknowledgement, no uncomfortable shift in the balance he had chosen to maintain. And for a brief moment, I wondered if he would say something more, if he would step outside the boundaries that had been quietly drawn around him. But he did not, and that silence settled between us like something final. He offered to call me the next day, the way people do when they want to fulfill an obligation without committing to anything deeper, and I smiled. A small, steady smile that felt lighter than any I had worn earlier that evening, and I told him that would not be necessary, that I had a few things to take care of in the coming days, and I saw the flicker of surprise in his expression, not because of what I said, but because of how I said it, calm, certain, without the usual softness that had once made it easy for him to assume I would always be there waiting. The drive home was quiet, the roads nearly empty, lined with houses glowing warmly from within, each one holding its own version of celebration, its own version of connection, and I found myself thinking not about what I had lost, but about what I had finally seen clearly, because there is a difference between being alone and being excluded, and understanding that difference changes everything. When I reached my house, I did not turn on the television or fill the silence with noise. I simply walked through the familiar rooms, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a table, grounding myself in a space that still felt entirely mine, and I made a cup of tea the way I always had, measuring each step with quiet precision, letting the routine settle my thoughts into something steady and deliberate. On the kitchen counter, I placed my keys beside the envelope I had brought home 2 weeks earlier, the one I had read carefully more than once, the one that held the kind of clarity I had spent years avoiding, and I stood there for a moment, looking at it without opening it, because I no longer needed to confirm what it contained. I already understood its significance. Tonight had not been the beginning of anything. It had been the confirmation of everything. And as I turned off the light and let the house fall into a calm, unbroken quiet, I knew that the next steps I would take would not be guided by emotion or hesitation, but by a certainty that had taken far too long to arrive. And this time, I would not be the one adjusting to their decisions. They would be the ones adjusting to mine. The following days moved with a quiet precision that no one outside of my own thoughts could have noticed, each step unfolding exactly as I had planned, not rushed, not forced, just steady, deliberate, and completely under control. And I found a certain clarity in that rhythm, in knowing that every small action now served a purpose that extended beyond the moment itself. I did not reach out to Daniel, and he did not reach out to me, and that silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like space, space that allowed everything to settle into its true shape without interference or illusion. And in that space, I began to see just how much had been built on assumptions I had never questioned. A few days later, my phone rang, and when I saw his name on the screen, I let it ring once more before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I no longer felt the need to respond immediately. And when I finally picked up, his voice carried the same careful tone I had heard on the porch, polite, measured, as if he were stepping lightly across something fragile that he did not fully understand. He asked how I was doing, whether I had made it home safely after Christmas, and I answered simply, calmly, giving him nothing more than what was asked. And when the conversation paused, he filled it with small talk, updates about work, a mention of the renovation plans Ashley had been so eager to describe, and I listened without interruption, noting how easily he spoke about changes that once would have included me without question, and how naturally he now excluded me without acknowledgement. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that they were thinking about making some adjustments to the house in the coming months, possibly reworking the guest room to better fit their needs, and I recognized the phrasing immediately, the careful way it was presented as a practical decision rather than a deliberate one, and I responded with a quiet understanding, telling him that it sounded like a good plan, that they should do what made sense for them, and I could almost hear the relief in his silence. The way my lack of resistance made everything easier for him, just as it always had. What he did not realize was that this time, my agreement was not an act of accommodation. It was an observation, a final confirmation of the direction they had chosen, and I allowed him to continue speaking, to explain things he did not need to explain, to justify decisions that had already been made without me, because every word he offered only strengthened the foundation of what I was preparing. After we ended the call, I placed the phone down gently and sat for a moment, not reflecting, not questioning, just acknowledging that everything was aligning exactly as it needed to. And I reached for my notebook again, adding a few final details, small adjustments to timing, confirmations that would ensure there were no gaps, no uncertainties when the moment arrived. Later that week, I made one more call, this time inviting them to dinner, suggesting a simple evening, nothing formal, just a chance to sit down together. And Daniel agreed almost immediately, his tone light, perhaps even relieved, as if this invitation signaled a return to something familiar, something safe. And I could hear Ashley in the background, her voice faint but approving, and I smiled. Not because of what they believed this invitation meant, but because of what I knew it would become. And as I set the date and ended the call, I understood with complete certainty that the next time we sat across from each other, the balance of that table would no longer be what they expected, and this time, I would not be the one quietly adjusting to fit within it. The evening arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if even the air understood that something important was about to unfold, and I moved through my kitchen with the same calm precision I had carried all week, setting the table carefully, placing each plate, each glass, each folded napkin exactly where it belonged, not out of habit but out of intention, because tonight was not just a dinner, it was a moment that had been building long before any of them realized it. When the doorbell rang, I did not rush to answer it. I walked steadily, composed, and when I opened the door, Daniel stood there with Ashley beside him, both of them carrying the same polite expressions they had worn so often before, expressions that suggested ease, normalcy, a shared understanding that nothing had truly changed, and I stepped aside to let them in, greeting them warmly, offering them a seat as if this were just another evening, just another continuation of something familiar. Ashley complimented the house, her eyes moving quickly across the room, taking in details without really seeing them, and Daniel asked how I had been, his tone light, careful, and I answered simply, guiding them to the table where everything was already prepared, everything in place. And as they sat down, I noticed the small shift in their posture, the subtle awareness that something felt different even if they could not yet name it. Dinner began quietly, conversation moving through safe topics, work, travel, small updates that filled the space without requiring anything deeper, and I listened, responding when necessary, allowing the rhythm to settle before I gently reached for the folder I had placed beside my chair, resting my hand on it for a brief moment before lifting it onto the table. The movement was simple, almost unremarkable, but it changed the atmosphere instantly, drawing their attention in a way no words had yet done, and I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross Ashley's face as her gaze shifted from the folder to me, searching for context that had not yet been given. I opened it slowly, not rushing, not dramatizing, just allowing the quiet weight of the moment to speak for itself, and I began to explain, my voice steady, measured, outlining the terms that had been set, the conditions that had been clearly defined, the protections that had been carefully arranged. And as the meaning settled into the room, I watched their expressions change, not abruptly, but gradually, the confidence that had once come so easily beginning to falter as they realized that what they had assumed was secure had never truly been theirs to control. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow tightening as he tried to process the details, asking questions that revealed more confusion than understanding, while Ashley remained still, her silence sharper now, more focused, as if she were recalculating something she had believed was already decided, and I answered each question calmly, without accusation, without emotion, simply presenting what was already in place, what had been waiting quietly for the moment it was needed. When I finished, there was a silence that felt entirely different from the ones that had filled our previous conversations, not empty, not avoidant, but full, complete, leaving no space for misunderstanding or dismissal. And I closed the folder gently, resting my hands on the table as I looked at them both, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a clarity that needed no explanation, because everything that mattered had already been said, and for the first time, I could see that they understood the difference between what they had assumed and what was actually true. And as that realization settled over them, I knew that the balance of this room had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by words, not by time, not by anything they might try to say next, because this time, I was no longer the one quietly adjusting. I was the one who had decided where everything would stand.